Okay, why don't we proceed to your next slide? That'll bring everybody back.
Sure. So the next group of activities or services we listed or gathered from other lists, activities that the board staff would take on behalf or in support of LMAs. Again, this came from the same, list of work groups and items from the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and discussions as before. I'll give you a little time to digest the list if you haven't already. Certainly ask questions, seek clarification on items, and then provide opinion and feedback.
What do we mean by Prop 218 technical support?
Yeah, so that was one of the elements I think that was included under FMAP, but it's support for LMAs to basically develop the engineer's report up to the point of carrying out a 218 proceeding. I think the technical support being, any additional studies or engineering opinions required to identify and apportion benefit.
Bill, I have a question.
Yeah. Joe?
Are we looking at things that the board is doing or that the state is doing?
It looks like both. That's a good question for Scott, I think.
Yes, right now, I think it is open to administrative services carried on by the state in general, whether it's DWR or the Central Valley Flood Protection Board.
Scott, has there been any effort to put a percentage on what these administrative costs ought to be?
Not at this time. We've only just begun to put the list out there to gauge stakeholder feedback on whether they feel the assessment should be funding these activities or they should be coming out of general funds. We have not tried to put a dollar amount on it or a cost share amount on it.
Well, in your discussions locally, these are essentially state overhead costs. Seems to me there's going to be if these get too high, there's going to be a little negative feedback.
Yeah, I think, and Ruth can chime in here as well, but I think there was some pushback on funding for additional board staff. Items 9, 10, 11, kind of additional FTEs there. I'll let Ruth kind of chime in and provide her opinion of what she heard.
Yes, thank you, Scott. President Egger, we've heard that we might not get support if we suggest funding for any new board program. So granted, there's some administrative costs that are going to go if this is feasible and it's implemented, but we've heard that folks don't want this to fund planning of any kind. It was kind of why my response to board member Countryman was the way it was in terms of the designated floodway program, just because I've heard that several times from stakeholders. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
It would be extremely difficult to implement an efficient program that is a feasible, an assessment district without administrative cost and it running smoothly and efficiently and having staff that is dedicated to running it. I think that's generally a percentage, a standard percentage used for facilitating and running a program like that, but I think that there's some pushback that comes with just trust in terms of trusting state agencies to use money efficiently. But that's all I have on that.
Any other board members want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, this is Brian.
Oh, hi, Brian.
I mean, just following up on that conversation, I want to make sure that I'm approaching this the right way. My understanding is that this, what we're looking at today and providing feedback now isn't a recommendation or a plan from consultants to the board, so much as it's a list of possible services that seem like they might make sense under some circumstances that will then be evaluated along with analysis of potential beneficiaries and through the process that will then come back into recommendations for really what's in and what's not. And that the feedback we're looking for is something that's really obvious that ought to be on this list so that it can be evaluated, or something if we saw something that just really doesn't make any sense at all, it's not worth spending the time. Am I approaching that the right way?
Yes, I agree 100%.
Okay, thank you. I would keep them on the list and evaluate it.
Thank you.
I think Ruth, as a general, just a general thought, we ought to try to eliminate, or we ought to try to limit these administrative services to those services directly related to running the assessment district, not to programs that we should be seeking additional funds for. That'd be just my own thought, but.
And that's noted. I appreciate that, President Edgar. And the thought too was, and I think this was mentioned before, that we think it's in our best interest to keep this list populated, and then as things fall off, have the notes as to why they did. So for transparency reasons, right? We've considered everything we've heard, and this is why it didn't work out the way that it did, as opposed to being on the other end of.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I agree with that. I just, just as a general thought, I don't think we're necessarily going to raise funds for supporting the board, even though the legislature has told us to do this, where the board existing staff for doing the kinds of work that we're doing now, and permitting and inspections and things like that. I think these administrative costs ultimately have got to be related to running this district, I think. And then there may be some, technical support categories or something else, but the administrative costs ought to be related to running the district just as generally, or the locals are not going to support it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After many years of working with the locals and being part of that, any idea that this money would be used for studies, for planning, for analysis, they see that as a big black hole where money just gets thrown in and the state just consumes it and nothing happens. So there'll be very little support for that, very little.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Bill, I'll just point out one more thing maybe. The presentation, at its breadth, the very beginning was about OM and then RRR. And everything else has been projects and things that are under those categories. This seems, some of them are related, but some of them are not. There are things that people generally probably would like to do, haven't had an easy time generating money for them. Some of those things probably will not stay on this list very long. I'm not against keeping them on now, but I think it's going to be very hard, to Joe's point, to have some of these things fall away.
Right. Yeah, some of them are, it seems to me we're replacing or supplanting money that for things that we ought to be doing now just as a state responsibility, inspections, enforcement, and those kinds of things. But anyway, yeah, I get that we're just developing the list, and then, as Brian said, they'll fall off after analysis. But yeah.
I didn't mean to be speaking broadly about everything. I was commenting. I specifically, I think we were talking about administering the district itself, and beyond that, I think there's a process to say, as Ruth did, what was assessed and what was eliminated, and things that are tied to whatever is decided is the function of the district. There will be alignment on this page with the rest of it, I would think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would agree. Okay. Anything else on from the board or public? Leslie or Ryan, do you see anybody raising their hand?
I don't have anything else from board members, Mr. President.
Okay.
I don't see anything either.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Okay, let's move on, Scott.
All right, so this next category moves from the O&M to the capital improvements portion. So these are fairly broad, system-wide improvement concepts, not individual specific projects within that system, but just a listing of sort of programs that could receive funding potentially from this assessment district for regional improvements. I think there's been a mixed response, primarily in the discussion of whether or not the system-wide, the system, sort of air quoting, the system is a state responsibility. Certainly that's the case for 8361 facilities and the O&M requirements, and some of that has also been considered for capital improvements, that feeling from stakeholders, where others also feel in opposite opinion that this program, this SSJDD assessment, could fund targeted capital improvements within the system, and be able to cast a wider net of beneficiaries to fund that specific capital improvement.
Scott, this is Laura. I would just add that these specific categories are directly from the capital list in the 2017 update in Chapter 4. So if folks aren't familiar with the way they're kind of put together, that's directly where they come from. So they're, like you said, they are broader, kind of a broader set of management actions. They're not specific projects. So,
Laura, were these meant to be done with bond funds as opposed to? Tim raised the question about, we started off the discussion talking about OMRRR and trying to deal with all of the cost needs related to that. Now we're into capital improvements, which I thought the plan said pretty much that capital improvements, that is not operation, maintenance, repair, and whatever, be done with bond issues. Is that not correct, or what?
it's partially correct, Mr. President. So basically, the investment strategy looked at paying for the large sum of capital improvements by various different mechanisms. If you recall, there's $12 to $16 billion worth of capital improvements proposed in the 2017 update. So that's looking at, a cost share between state, federal, local partners by all different types of mechanisms. And actually, in the investment strategy, we did use the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District as a mechanism that could potentially pay for this, for capital improvements. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will. It's just we were trying to, fill the gap, if you will, for the remaining funds that needed to be covered. But, big portion of it is by bonds, big portion of it is by, obviously the core kicking in on the federal side, and then the locals would have to kick in on their local cost share side. But that's why they're on this list, is because we applied the SSJDD in the investment strategy to these overall categories. I mean, the dollar amount is in the investment strategy is much, much smaller. Obviously, if we're talking about $25 million per year, that doesn't go very far towards these big capital improvements. But there's also in the original statute for the assessment district, capital improvements is mentioned. So we thought we should probably list these as well and make sure, or just entertain this discussion if it's something that we all think that it should fund or could fund. Does that help?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to do is we need to bifurcate these funds. We have a process with the core, which is the normal capital improvement projects that you go through, and we do have a process at the state for these large capital improvements. And they're with the core, it's true, they go through the costs and you go through all of these processes and come up with a study and a feasibility approach and so on, and the state has to put in its share. But it seems to me that those are the big costs that necessarily have to be done by bond issues. There's such a gap in operation, maintenance, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement that it seems to me this funding source ought to be primarily dedicated to that. And the minor capital improvements, which, small community levee repair things that should be probably determined to be rehabilitation or whatever, those kinds of things are OMRRR. But capital improvements ought to be the big ones that we intend to fund by bonds. And we ought to try to distinguish between that, because we aren't going to be, we just don't have enough money here to take care of all of the OMRRR, let alone, even the debt service on a huge bond issue, I don't think is, I mean, that's going to take too much money, too much of the revenue stream.
Right. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
appreciate that comment. We'll definitely take that into consideration. I think just as we've been talking about earlier this morning, keeping these items on the list and then noting why they fall off is probably a good approach to some
Yeah,
of these
well,
items.
yeah, another thing that needs to be done is to look at those local RFMPs, because there's a lot of projects in there that they determine to be capital projects that are really rehabilitation or repair projects. And
Mhm.
they need to be separated out from what we would really call major capital improvements. These system-wide, the some of these system-wide projects are too big for this funding source, I would think. Anyway, that's just something that I'm kind of looking at.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. If you look, I think they showed $25 million as a possible annual assessment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a ballpark, right?
So you're not going to be doing much capital improvement with that.
Yeah, right.
So I think you have to be realistic about what you say you're going to do with this money, because it's really not going to go to system-wide improvements and stuff like that. It's just not big enough.
Plus, you use it up, and not fund the little things that we talked about before in terms of OMRRR on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and that's where we're short. That's where we need to come forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. But anyway, Laura, I think what needs to happen here is as we go through what's deemed to be capital and what's deemed to be OMRRR, we've got to kind of fly spec those a little bit, because I think there's some projects in the capital improvement area that probably should be put in the other area, and maybe vice versa. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with what you're saying. I think that makes sense. We'll have to take a closer look at it.
Okay, anybody else? Leslie, see anybody?
It's time, Mr. President.
Okay, any public members, Ryan?
None that I can see.
I sent an email.
Was this Melinda Terry?
Yes.
On this?
Agenda item number 5 yet?
Yeah, for item number 5, once you guys are done, yeah.
No, we're not done with this part. You can
Okay.
comment, Melinda, if you have any comments. Would be pleased to hear.
Honestly, my comments are so extensive, I'm just gonna wait.
Okay. Okay, we're on to other services, Scott.
All right, so this was our catch-all bag. We just called it other services just because it didn't seem to fit in exactly with any of the other activities specifically itemized. This is likely where tribal consultation will fall under when we recategorize that. But this was, concerns or items that came up as hindering LMA's ability to do O&M activities, or the 3R activities. And so we placed them in here. Nothing specific about any one of them to discuss from my point of view, other than just to review and see if there's anything else that you feel especially when you we're talking about the quote unquote little things that LMAs are falling short on, make sure that we're not missing anything in this last sort of grab bag of services.
Scott, when we're talking about ancillary services studies and permitting, what's that mean? Does that mean paying the permitting costs for some of these activities or what?
Make sure I'm off mute. Yes, I think this was the item that was used to capture the fact that an under-resourced LMA would prefer to, and I'm not trying to state this as fact, but I believe this is what we've heard, that they prefer to do work on the ground. They prefer to maintain their levees, spend their money keeping levees up, and these other services are what tend to draw money away from their current funds and away from actual maintenance work. It was kind of a catch-all, nothing specific, just that general concept. But within that, where is their attention being drawn away from carrying out their O&M responsibilities?
Okay, what's the first one mean? Water supply pumping. What is that?
I'm going to pull Laura in here, but I believe those are facilities that are not in the state plan of flood control themselves, but are sort of ancillary to it, that LMAs have to maintain that benefit state plan of flood control facilities. But Laura, can you confirm that?
Yeah, that's kind of what we were intending there. There's it doesn't say on there, but non-project levies that, they're, and other facilities that maybe have, dual purpose for water supply or other types of services. And they're, the integrity of those facilities provides a benefit to the SPFC. And there's costs associated with maintenance of those. So it definitely could be worded better. I recognize that, but that's the intention of that line item.
Okay.
Mr. President, Board Member Ramirez had a comment.
Yeah, Tim.
Just real quick, I think comment was made that this is where tribal would go potentially as well. I think we should draw a line where things are required because of other authorities, like the tribal consultation, like compliance with environmental regulations. Maybe that's the umbrella that captures all those things, requirements. This seems to me to be a place where we've listed the other things that we struggle with. That's not a big surprise, and I think the question really is, appropriate to use the fund source to pay for any of that. These are ones I see here, not requirements that are part of doing operations and maintenance. Maybe a couple of them might be related to it, but that's I think the effort here is to sort that out.
Thank you. We'll make note of that. I think I understand what it took you to say it a couple times. I apologize, but I'm there with your classification now.
That seems to be a good comment, Scott. If we could just have maybe one category as requirements, Endangered Species Act, tribal consultation, Section 7 consultation. Those are all requirements that have to be met. These kind of are like the first one, payment for facilities that have to be maintained but aren't necessarily flood protection services. And we had an example of that, I think, in the San Joaquin, where it was pointed out that they have a combination plant and so on. And some of these other issues. But there needs to be a separation there. One thing on the climate change impacts, it seems to me that this is already being funded. This is a major priority for the state right now, trying to deal with this approach to climate change. And the impacts of that are significant. And what SJAFCA has responded to is saying that we're going to build a system that's resilient enough to absorb the climate change impacts as they occur over time. And that's what they intend to do. It seems to me that this source of funds would be supplanting state money that's being used for that purpose anyway. And that doesn't seem to be a correct use of the money. And on these services, Scott, I think you need to take a real look at what these exactly are and whether we're really supplanting existing state funds that are being used to do them. Anyway.
Yes, thank you. I think, again, casting the wide net of potential services, was the intent of the list, but we've clearly heard today that any of these that supplant an existing funding source from the state or requirement for funding from the state should be eliminated from the list.
Yeah, I think that's just gonna raise a lot of problems with the stakeholders. Okay, any other questions on this? Okay, and I think you have one more slide. Or is this Kim?
I can turn it over to Kim here quickly to talk about the remaining stakeholder engagement of this first stage. But just broadly speaking, the next steps is through June 2020. Solicit feedback from stakeholders through meetings to hone in on the list that they would support. And then we would develop criteria to screen that list down even further. And I think that I guess my parting thought would be that this $25 million of proposed funding, I kind of view as an empty glass. And each of these services that we've proposed out there, we're looking for those that have common support or broad support to start filling up that glass and hopefully reach 25 million. Perhaps it's more than 25 million or it's less, but that would also help inform the update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that's coming up. So kind of where we are now. Kim, would you like to say a few things about remaining stakeholder engagement plan and maybe the next ones beyond that?
So we still have several meetings in the San Joaquin region to schedule and conduct before the end of June. But the goal would be to get those done before the end of May. I just want to acknowledge again that we understand that the process that we're asking people to participate now is a little different than they're maybe used to, and it's uncomfortable. I think it would have been easier for people if the consultant team had proposed services and then allowed people to react to that. But again, we're really trying to ask stakeholders to give us kind of help us lead us to a series of services or a service that has general consensus for study. And that is, as you can imagine, it's easier to disassemble something than it is to go the opposite direction. So we're asking people to have faith. At the end of this phase, we will have a very deep dive into the stakeholder input and how we're going to work through, again, as Scott said, screening those lists of services to come up with the final services that will be studied for feasibility. So thanks for everybody for hanging in there.
Well, thanks, Kim. Are you going to require any of the board members or staff, I guess Ruth and so on, will be there, anybody to accompany you to these meetings?
We have Ruth always attends. Darren Suen frequently attends if he hasn't attended all of them. I think he has. So we do have board staff participate. We keep detailed notes. Following the meeting, we send the notes back out to the stakeholder group so that they can review what we've captured, add comments, clarify things. We just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So there'll be a very robust, again, a deep dive at the end of this where we'll be sharing all of that input.
Okay.
And by the end, I don't mean the end of the study. I mean by the end of this first phase.
Okay.
The first step.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else at this point by the board members or the public? Leslie, Ryan?
I don't have any more board requests, Mr. President.
I don't have any from the public.
Okay. You'll see on the screen that there's the contact information for Ruth, Scott, and Kim Floyd. In case anybody has any questions, I certainly want to provide the opportunity for commenting. Okay, if that ends item 4, we're on item 5, and I believe Melinda Terry had a comment on item 5. Melinda, you're there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Sure.
I wish I only had one comment, so bear with me. But for those of you that don't know, the Delta Protection Commission went through a similar process because they were required through the Delta plan to do a feasibility study of creating a Delta-wide assessment district, and spent at least a year and a half of my life working on that. So I'll just start off by, pointing out that this new assessment is, while it's a new revenue source, it's merely another mechanism to collect more money from landowners. So it's really just a new methodology. Actually, it's not really a new revenue source. And that's what I said. It's not a new source of funding. It's just another mechanism to collect more from the landowners. And then in the slide presentation earlier, then you've got another river basin assessment, which again is a property assessment, which would layer on another collection, from the landowners. As many of you know, I'm the manager of the North Delta Water Agency, and we do collect the property assessments. And I find it fascinating that twice a year, every year, of how many phone calls we get into our office asking questions about the assessment they are paying. And keep in mind, I kid you not, that most of these phone calls are from people that are paying $9 a year. Okay. You know, so when you see, I live in West Sacramento, so when you see your tax bill, and I remember when I moved here, I looked at it, I made the same phone calls. I exactly remember doing it because I had more than one fire thing on there. And I was like, why am I paying more than one fire? Well, if you live in an urban area, you do have that layered thing. Now, I know what the difference is between the assessment that I paid to the RD and the assessment that I paid to WASAFCA, right? But the average landowner does not understand that difference. But there is a difference. I know that I'm paying my RD for the O&M, for the levee facilities and for drainage. WASAFCA, they're doing levee improvements to make sure we're not paying outrageous flood insurance costs. But once they're done, they turn that maintenance over to the RD and I'm paying. So there are two different things. And so that's, I think, part of what needs to be considered if you're looking at layering on another assessment for the locals to pay, is what's the difference? So, you know, I heard you guys talk about OM, RR, and R. Well, if they're already paying a portion for the O&M, why do they need to pay more? And when I look at the list that you all just spent 2.5 hours going through, while I appreciate what, you know, Kim said at the end there, in reality, I just spent 2.5 hours to the opposite. It wasn't the ideas that the LMAs have necessarily come up with. This is a list of what the consultants came up with, and you all spent a great, you know, 2.5 hours on it. But the reality is there's too much on this list. And if you're lucky, you collect 25 million. I've not seen the math on whoever figured out that number and how it was determined, but under a beneficiary pays, you have to make sure that whatever assessment is being collected is then going into projects that actually benefit the parcels that you collected funding from. So depending on what activities you do, I'm not sure that you'll be able to collect from everybody, because your district, unfortunately, is so large. And we already know there's huge differences between the SAC system and the San Joaquin, but even within those systems, there are differences in terms of, you know, where you could supplant or, you know, where the voids may exist. But this list is too large. You need to focus in more on what types of activities could you even do for 25 million. I think that's the amount that, you know, the new FMAP program was given, and I think you've already experienced it doesn't go very far. And if you're collecting it again and then it's going only to certain projects in certain areas, but you collected from everyone, you've got a legal problem. And so it's those types of weaknesses are what's supposed to be identified, you know, in a feasibility study. But I really, really, you know, it makes me think of the discussion that I listened to on the list and all these different categories that you had on the different pages. Honestly, when I look at the list, most of them appear to be what I would at least consider to be state responsibilities, not the locals' responsibilities. So it's unclear to me why they should pay an additional assessment. But you know, it kind of reminds me in, you know, in the COVID situation that we're in, where we see the governors, you know, be in disagreement with the federal administration on who should be, you know, paying and providing for this testing and the PPEs, right? Whose role is it and responsibility? So it's a proportionality thing too. I think there's a cost share there, but the question is, okay, well, what portion is the state already paying for operation and maintenance of its system versus what are the locals paying? You know, what's their total collection? And, you know, keep in mind that only a portion of the assessment they collect is, you know, can even go for maybe the actual levy O&M. A portion has to go towards drainage and some other stuff. You know, the other thing when you look at the list is think about, at least for, you know, there are things to think about, though. The locals, for instance, when they do their Prop 218, have to do an engineer's report. So you can't spend money on activities, by the RD anyway, that are beyond really what's identified to those voters in that engineer's report. So for instance, you may have things like, we've got all these multi-benefit projects, that the state wants to fund with bond funding. But the locals may not be allowed to fund the O&M for that because it really is not identified, in their engineer's report. So there are things you can look at, but again, you have to look at the bandwidth of $25 million. And again, that I've not seen the math if that is the correct number. So again, this list does need to be narrowed. I was glad to hear towards the end of your 2.5-hour discussion that you did start getting to the point of noting the items that really shouldn't be on the list at all. But I think that before you even go to a next step of the beneficiary pays analysis, it's a waste of time to analyze all these activities and figure out who the beneficiary pays, because you're going to have to narrow your focus and really think about what's your purpose. Is your objective that through this assessment to try to get everyone, in active status for PL 8499, or is it, to be able to achieve some kind of multi-objective things? I mean, you have to kind of know what it is you're trying to achieve to even know what activities might fit in with what's your end goal. What are you trying to do? But as I said, it's really important to make sure this list gets narrowed. And I literally think you can't, with the $25 million, you're going to have to pick one. I mean, I don't even see how you can do a handful with 25 million. I mean, is it O&M,
Melinda, this is Kim Floyd, if I can. Is that all right, President Edgar?
Actually, if I could just finish, I'll try to finish up. So, that's my request. Our folks we've got a subcommittee. I guess we'll take this list and Kim, please chime in after I'm done on this. I guess we can go through the process of going through this list and putting on telling you, no, take what things should be taken off to try to help you narrow down. But we really do, want to be able to see what that happened before going to the next step. Then I've also prepared a paper that I've shared with Kim and Scott and those folks of some of the other things that we, learned and discussed, the issues that came up during the DPC's process. And, but they are the issues that go beyond the list, which is there's a lot that, the locals are going to be concerned about in terms of, who is collecting the fee, who makes the decisions of which projects get done, again, because you have such a limited pot, which projects get done and where they get done becomes a big deal. And that is one of the legal problems that the state responsibility wildfire fee has and is currently under litigation and ultimately was suspended by the legislature recently. So there's lots of those issues, but I tried to just stick it to right now since you focused on the list of, so Kim, I hope you will, chime in on that part.
Well, and we agree with you, Melinda, about the need to narrow it down. I think the list, again, as we have discussed in all of the stakeholder meetings at the coordinating committee and at the board presentation, that the list was a brain dump to prompt discussion. Because we are asking stakeholders to give us input about what services they could support going forward, we didn't want to draw those conclusions or exclude those and then just present that back to the stakeholders as a done deal. So it is an uncomfortable position, I think. It is easier, as you can see from the discussions we've been in up to this point, to say no to things than to identify what it is that might be supported, to point out the problems instead of the opportunities. So what we're asking again through this process is for people to mark up those lists, but it's not meant to be a, you know, strike every one or we're going to include it. That's not what will happen. What we're hoping is to identify areas where we have some consensus, areas that make sense. Then look at a screening process, which we'll vet with stakeholders, to narrow it down to 1 or 2 or 3 services, whatever it is that we think the funding can support and the benefit justifies, and then move forward. But, you know, if you go back to the process that we've outlined, this is very iterative. So this is getting stakeholder input, putting it all together, taking it back to stakeholders to say, did we hear you? Is this an accurate reflection? And as Board Member Ramirez mentioned early on, at some point the board will have to make a decision about, yes, these are the services we're pushing forward. But to get to that point, we're asking people to work through this first phase. So I understand that it's uncomfortable. I understand that it's a different process, but the list was never intended to be everything we would fund.
That's my point. And that's my point, Kim. What my ask is that list be narrowed sooner, you know, before the next step of evaluating who pays, because it's a waste of time to evaluate beneficiaries.
We can't evaluate who pays, Melinda, until we know what service we're funding. So it has to be. And if you look at our process that we've outlined, that's been made pretty clear, that we identify the services and then we go into evaluating benefit.
That's what we're going to be looking for, and you know, that's part of the work. The process itself doesn't bother me, Kim. I'm just saying that I don't want to see these things stay on for too long as we enter the next phase, the next step in your process. Because they
definitely won't. This phase ends at the end of June. Then we'll be reporting back out, and before moving to the next phase.
Yeah, this part is fine. The important thing is just next to each of them that you're deleting, you do need to identify what's the weakness with them, you know, and so that it's clear that, look, we did look at everything, but there's a reason why these were eliminated. That's an important part of the process. For now, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Melinda. I think we've lost Bill momentarily.
Oh.
I think he had to step off to take a phone call. So are there any other members of the public that we had on the list, Ryan? Or any board members wanted to respond to Melinda's comments or stuff?
I don't see any comments from the public.
Leslie or Ryan, this is Chris Newdeck. I thought I put my hand up on the, is it possible to make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Go, Chris.
Okay, actually one's a question and maybe one's a comment. I'll start off with a comment, and it relates to the issue with regards to cost share. I'm not following the theory behind cost share on an assessment district. As Melinda somewhat outlined, and I think that your staff outlined, on a property owner-based assessment, the beneficiary should be receipt of that funding, and it shouldn't be broken down on a cost share basis. A cost share basis is typically a grant program that the general fund or bond funds from the state are being distributed out to parties, and we fully appreciate the cost share basis. I don't necessarily agree, and I think there was a good debate on, a generalized cost share across the board. I think the State Department of Water Resources does an excellent job at establishing variances in their cost shares, and I don't think I would get too detailed with that because they've done a good job over the years. But I just don't see where a cost share is applicable to an assessment district. That's number one. That's a comment. The second one is a question. is this assessment district only going to be related to those levee maintenance districts or levee maintenance areas or reclamation districts that are part of the state plan of flood control, or will it be broader? That's more of a question. I don't know who can answer that. I'll race to answer it.
Has the team looked at that, Ruth or Scott?
Hi, this is Ruth Darling. Initially, because the way the statute's currently written, it's state plan of flood control, but we have opened the door to potentially funding facilities outside of the SPFC.
Okay, well that, Ruth, as you can well imagine, that'll change how your comments will come forward, because, you know, there's a whole series of levee districts outside that don't have any state plan of flood control facilities upon them. So that's probably something we should get clarified, or just suggest that it's going to be the entire district.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This is Melinda. That's the kind of thing that should be evaluated in the next step when you get there, of who benefits from that activity. It could be people that are outside of the boundary of the district, but as I recall, even the existing law allows the district to collect outside that boundary if whatever is being proposed is benefiting those lands.
Okay, do we see any other comments?
Mr. President, we appear to have some difficulty recognizing when someone's raising their hand. Chris Nudak just mentioned that he thought he had raised his hand, but I don't know, Ryan, if you're seeing it. I'm not seeing it on my list. So maybe we could just ask if there are folks on the phone.
I'm seeing it on my list. I was only checking my email when I made that comment. So we can see if, or at least I can on my end. And I have no hands other than Chris's, and I imagine that's regarding his other comment.
That's correct, Ryan. I don't have any further comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott or Ruth, I think Melinda has a good point here. In terms of, we're obviously going to narrow this down, and but I think in addition to narrowing it down in terms of services, we need to establish kind of a goal, you know, for the revenue of this district. Now, this may not come until the next phase or whatever, but we ought to have a goal. Either we're going to try to achieve PL 84 and 99 status for all the LMAs that are in the jurisdiction, or this is the revenue stream from this source of revenue is going to OMRRR and not capital improvements, or some stated goals like that would essentially narrow it down generally, and then we'll get to a list of services under that. So I think there needs to be some overarching goals as we go forward on this. As we start to narrow and take down these items, we can kind of, in our own head, reasonably infer the goal behind it. Either it's supplanting money that's already being used by the state or whatever, but establish some goals so that, you know, you have a general goal in mind, and then the list of services kind of fall out of that. I think that would be helpful.
Bill, if I could, this is Melinda. Yeah, the way I would think about it is, like I described earlier, is it's very easy for me to explain to my neighbors the difference between the assessment that they pay for the RD, which does the operation and maintenance of the levees, and then the assessment that they pay to WSAFCA that is doing these capital improvements in our area. And so the trick with this one will be being able to describe how that third layer with this district assessment, what service that it's providing that might be, different than those and yet benefiting.
For example, the report that Mark lists comes up every year on the maintenance area budgets that he submits to the board. The question you always ask of him is, now, is this enough money for those LMAs to meet their service obligations for PL 8499? And he says, no, it's not. So if you're gonna, if that's your goal, there's an increment there of money that needs to be provided in order to increase the maintenance and operation of these levy districts. And
but then you get into the proportionality issue. So let's say that right now, all the RDs, when you combine them all up, that their assessments collect 50 million, let's just say, for this operation and maintenance of these project levies. And as we know, currently anyway, 25 million the state is providing for O&M through FMAP. Well, if you're asking then those that are already paying 50 million and the states are only paying 25 to pay another 50, whose portion, of that, that need, whose responsibility is it really?
yeah, well, that's when you get into the baseline issue. But what I'm saying is there needs to be, in addition, before you kind of start picking out the specific services, it'd be nice to have a goal, and that's we need to establish first, and then we can get the other issues. And we've talked to people about that before, that you don't want to reward the people that aren't paying should be anyway. So I get that, but it seems to me there needs to be an overall goal here, or 2 or 3 or whatever it is. That
like I said, it's trying to figure out what's that layer. Like I said, I can explain an RD with their assessment, with the AFCA.
Right.
Yeah, it's just figuring out what that layer is and what that goal of that layer is. Like the other.
I think that would go pretty far. Anyway, okay. Brian, did you have a comment?
I do, because I think this discussion is really valuable, and some of Melinda's questions, run to things that I'm wondering, and back to the beginning of the present and the concept. If I wrote this quote down correctly, to supplement and not compete with existing state and local funding, and so I'm interested in the discussion around how to do that, given the great variability that we have across the geography of the district in terms of need and also in terms of capability, both potential capability, for an economic base in a particular part of the region, or capability with people who are institutions who are organized and doing things effectively in those places. And so I think, and then Melinda's point that some places have assessments or multiple assessments, and there's a practical question about the goal, as you said, Mr. President, and also legal questions about how to manage that. That I think having that discussion directly and being able to talk about different options for how to manage that variability would be a really good one to have. And I can leave that there as a placeholder, or if the consultants or Ruth or you or others have Melinda suggestions about how to think about that, I'd be interested. I think for example, I think I saw something in one of the scoping documents or RFP about there possibly being credits in the system for assessments that already exist for certain things. and setting aside whether I imagine that or it's a good idea, what possibilities are out there for managing that type of circumstance. I'd be interested in hearing more about that now if people are ready, or in future discussions.
I would like to follow up on that. I think it's a good point, and it's my guess, but I don't know if I'm correct. But yeah, my guess would be, to your point, Brian, that the needs, if you will, of what types of things need to be done in that third layer, or second layer if it's rural areas, will be different throughout the region because this district is so big. But that's just my guess. I'm actually hoping, I think that's that the work that the team is doing now for that outreach in each of these regions, that, as Kim said, in a bottom-up approach, I'm hoping that then at the end of the team going through this phase, that it will bubble up and possibly show that it's different in each region. And then that's a whole other thing that you need to think about in terms of the assessments of how you set them up.
Right.
I just wanted to say thank you for your comment, Brian. I'd like to think about it and get back to you. I don't have a response right now.
Fair enough.
Thanks.
Brian, this is Chris Newdeck. I've got one additional comment, if possible, to make.
Sure, Chris.
This is a comment that I was asked to make on behalf of one of our clients. Most of you know Steve Mello, who is the president of Reclamation District 563, which is Tyler Island. And he is not in favor of moving forward with this in any manner whatsoever, given the economic nature of a greater collection on a farmer doing business in the Delta. And he wanted to share with me, he shared this story with me recently here, and I asked him to repeat it. And he said, Chris, it cost me $100 an acre before I put, one shovel load of dirt in my field, or turn one clod of dirt in my field. And that's inclusive of property taxes, the district's assessment, the water quality assessment that's required from the drainage perspective, so that's the Water Quality Alliance, the water measurement, SB 88, and North Delta Water Agency, et cetera, et cetera. So that just gives you kind of a perspective of what a farmer is doing these days. And if you think about it, the profits on many of these crops are not substantially greater than probably $150 an acre. Now, mind you, if you had, grapes or other means and more financially suited crops, you can get a larger profit off them, in the sense that would be a greater profit. But in this particular instance, that just gives you kind of perspective of what a normal farmer sees from an assessment perspective. So adding to that is problematic, and that's all he wanted to share. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Any other questions from board members or public?
I don't see anything from the board, Mr. President.
Okay, thanks, Les. How about you, Ryan?
I see none from the public.
Okay, Leslie, I think we're gonna take this under advisement and hopefully get have this consultant team move forward and report back to us on an early date on some of the issues and questions we've raised.
Okay.
Is there anything else you want me to bring up at this point?
Nothing from here. Do we have anything else from the team? I would thank them all for coming today. You can see there's been a lot of work done already.
Yeah.
A lot of very considerate work and deliberate, and trying to look look at all possibilities to have the most success. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining and for the conversation. It's really helpful. I don't have anything else. I'm assuming if Scott or Kim did, they would chime in as well.
Nothing
Okay.
more, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. How about you, Scott?
No, nothing further here. Just it'll be
Okay, I
next
think,
time we'll be under duress to hone things down a little.
yeah, I think so, and kind of align them with a goal of some sort. You know, we've outlined a couple here, but I think that's going to be a key to our next discussions. Okay, members, if there isn't anything more on item 5, public comment, we'll move to item 6, which is adjournment. And without objection, this workshop and the update of the San Joaquin, Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage Assessment District feasibility is adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your patience to our technical problems. We'll try, as we go along, we'll try and resolve them. Thank you, everybody. Have a
Mr.
good,
President.
have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Good weekend.
Thank you.
All right.